Okay, here we are now for part 2 of the video lecture for chapter 16. Now we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about food webs, food chains and food webs. You very often hear the term food chain in the popular media and that sort of thing, but you very rarely hear discussion of food webs. Food webs are actually quite a bit more complicated than food chains are, and so we're going to focus on those primarily here. So basically, we know that organisms obviously have to get energy and nutrients to survive. They have to acquire these resources. We also know that competition, predation, parasitism, and mutualism can all affect the organism's ability to get those resources, to get food, energy, and nutrients, for example. Okay. The question is that a really important question, I guess I should say, in community ecology is how is it that species in a community interact to get the energy and nutrients that they absolutely must have in order to support their reproduction, growth, and in general, their metabolism. All right, so a food chain is basically a fairly simple representation of the relationships, or the feeding relationships rather, within a community. It's just a diagram that shows the flow of energy from prey to predator, okay? So these diagrams, or the arrows that we're going to see in these diagrams, represent the direction of flow of energy. They always go from what is being eaten to what is doing the eating, right? They go from prey to predator, okay? Or from the consumed to the consumer, we could say. All right. So, for example, in a simple grassland community, well, not simple, but in a grassland community, energy might flow from grass to a grasshopper. Grasshopper feeds on grass. From the grasshopper to a sparrow. The sparrow feeds on the grasshopper. And finally, from the sparrow to a hawk. The hawk is fed on the sparrow. And so the arrows would then go from the grass to the grasshopper, from grasshopper to sparrow, and from sparrow to hawk. So, it's a linear sort of relationship there as far as the food chain goes, all right? Sort of like a stepping stone sort of diagram or illustration. But actual feeding relationships in a community are not simple food chains, okay? They're not linear. Typically, they involve a number of different food chains that all sort of interweave or intermesh with each other into what we call a food web. This is a diagram that shows the complex interactions of all the predators and prey in a community. All right, and again, it usually consists of multiple different food chains. Okay, so at the base of any food web, what we have are what are called primary producers, okay? They're called producers because they produce food for everything else. So we're talking about typically photosynthetic organisms, right? Plants. They are the base of most food webs. They're called primary producers because they are what's actually carrying out carbon fixation, converting inorganic carbon as CO2 to organic carbon as carbohydrates, which becomes the basis for the food webs, or for everything above the level of the plants. All right, so here we have an example of a prairie grassland community food web. You can imagine this would be out in the Midwestern U.S., for example, Illinois, Kansas, those areas. And so what you can see is that we have, again, our primary producers, the plant community, the grassland plant community down here in the bottom, and then energy flows from those primary producers to various points within the animal community that we see above that. And so we have cutworms, for example, feeding on plants. We have grasshoppers feeding on plants. We have a crow feeding on the grasshopper and the cutworm, or maybe a garter snake feeds on the cutworm. Garter snake feeds on the frog, which is fed on the grasshopper, which fed on the plants. So again, this is showing you the paths of energy flow from our primary producers at the base of the food web all the way up to our top predators, in this case, the marsh hawk and the coyote. All right. So this is one very typical way of sort of illustrating food webs, okay? But there's another way that we're going to look at here in a moment that is a diagram that's meant more to show us the basic structure of the food web rather than the complex sort of mesh-like nature of it that we see in this sort of diagram here. Okay, So we have a couple of, or some terms that we need to define, okay, before we get into this sort of structural food web diagram here in a minute. First, we have what are called links, okay? The links are nothing more than the arrows from the consumed to the consumer. All right, so you can think about the arrow showing energy going from an herbivore to a carnivore, for example. That's a link, okay? It just shows us the direction of energy flow. We also have what are called basal species. These are usually autotrophs. So autotrophs are organisms that can feed themselves, typically through photosynthesis, but not always. So troph refers to feeding, auto means self. These are self-feeders. They can produce their own food without having to consume some other type of organism. And typically, again, this is plants doing this through photosynthesis, all right? Now, we also have what are called intermediate. If I could spell, that would help. Intermediate species, all right? These are typically either herbivores or carnivores that feed on other species and are the prey of other species themselves, okay? So we have those guys sort of in the middle of our food web in terms of the structural diagram we're getting ready to see. And then we have, finally, our top predators, all right? These are going to feed on intermediate and sometimes even on the basal species if they're omnivorous, that is, but they're typically not preyed upon themselves, okay? So, for example, there's not much that preys upon an orca, a killer whale. All right, so let's take a look at the structural diagram I was talking about. Okay, so again, this is meant to show the basic structural framework of the food web, all right? So we have our basal species down here in the bottom. Typically they're autotrophs, that's what the A is referring to, all right? So we have autotroph number 1 and number 2. Then here we have our intermediate species. We have both herbivores, that's what the H signifies, and there are some carnivores, again, that are considered to be intermediate species. And for example, this carnivore here, while it feeds on this particular herbivore, let's say, it also might feed on autotrophs. So that's an example of a carnivore that might be, or an intermediate species that might be an omnivore, right, feeding on both plant and animal tissue, okay? Here we have more of a strict carnivore just feeding on the herbivores, okay? No direct link between it and the plants at the basal level. Then we have our top predator up here, okay? So it can feed on some intermediate level carnivores, right? But also notice we have this arrow here looping back around onto itself. That indicates that these guys can be cannibalistic. In some cases, top predators will feed on members of their own species. Sharks are known to do this, various other species as well. It's not very common, but it does happen. But that's what that loop right there is meant to show, okay? So again, this is just showing us the basic structural framework of the food web. It's showing us the links in terms of in what directions energy is flowing and so on, and really who is feeding on whom in terms of basal species, intermediate species, and top predators. All right, so food webs then can be used to analyze community structure. In particular, these sorts of food web diagrams that I'm showing you here. The maximum number of links in a food web is a direct result of how species rich the community is. In other words, it takes into account species richness, right? You might suspect that the more species there are, the more possible links there would be, and that's certainly true. So if we have a food web that has a certain species richness, a certain number of species in it, if we make the assumption that is that each species may link to every other species, including itself, then the maximum number of links that we could have in that food web would be S squared, right? So species richness squared. That would give us the maximum number of links we could possibly have. That's not to say that food webs have these. I mean, typically they're going to have fewer than the maximum. This is just showing us theoretically how many links we could possibly have if we know, or based on rather, a given species richness, okay? The actual number of links, which is going to be a smaller number, is simply L, okay? So we have something called food web connectance. And connectance basically tells us the average number of links per species. That's what it tells us. And we calculate that by taking the number of links and dividing it by species richness squared. So what we're doing here is taking the number of links we actually have and dividing it by the theoretical number of links we could possibly have. That gives us the average number of links per species. That's what food web connectance is. Okay, it's just one way to sort of measure something about the structure of the food web. All right, so let's say, for example, we had our species richness of 7, okay? And let's say that the number of links that we actually have is 8. Well, the maximum number of links would be s squared, so that's 7 squared, which is 49. And the connectance then would be 8 divided by 49, which would be 0.16, okay? So if we had a connectance of 1.0, that would mean we'd have a maximally connected food web, and generally those don't exist, okay? Your actual connectance is going to be less than that. So this is just showing you one way that we can sort of quantify the relationships among the various species in the food web. Okay, there are other ways that we're going to see here in a moment as well. All right, so let's take a look at, let's look at this diagram here. So what you see here is sort of a hypothetical food web made up of 7 species. Okay, so we have our predators, we have one of those, actually 2 of those. We have one consumer, intermediate consumer. We have 2 intermediate herbivores, and we have 2 basal or autotrophic species. So we have a total then of 7 species. And this is going to show us food web connectance, what we call linkage density, and also what's called chain length. The chain length is actually shown by the arrows in red. Okay, that's an important thing to remember. Chain length is shown by the arrows in red. So if we look at number of species over here, we have 7. We've already decided we have a total number of links of 8. And in the previous slide, we did our maximum number of links. We calculated that as s squared of 49 and our connectance of 0.16. All right. Now, linkage density is going to be the number of links divided by the number of species. So in this case, that's going to be 8 divided by 7, so that's 1.14. All right. I'm sorry, linkage density is the actual average number of links per species. I said that was the case with connectance before. It's not. My apologies. Linkage density is the average number of links per species. So in this case, we have 1.14 links per species. That makes more sense. Have my wires crossed. All right. What about chain length? Well, so chain length for predator 1, what this is showing us is the number of links between that predator and the basal level of the food web, so the autotrophs here. All right, so for predator 1, right here, we have 1, 2, 3, okay? But also notice it says there are 4 over here. That's because we have, in addition to 1, 2, and 3, we follow the energy flow this way, we have another one right here that ultimately links that predator down to this autotroph. So count the red arrows, 1, 2, 3, 4. For predator 1, we have chain length of 4. For predator 2, we have 1, 2, but we see energy flowing this way, and there's our third one. So we have a chain length of 3. Mean chain length for this food web is simply the chain lengths of the individual, for each individual predator, added up and divided by 2, so 3.5. All right, and again, these are just various ways that ecologists use to sort of quantify the relationships between the species and in a food web. Okay, so let's go back to food web connectance for a moment. Food web connectance considers only the number of possible unidirectional links, okay? The number of unidirectional links, so links going in one direction. All right, the maximum number of links then, go over here for a second, the maximum number of links in this case is, going to be s times s minus 1 divided by 2, Okay, so again, S is going to be our species richness, all right? So we would take our species richness, multiply that by the species richness minus 1, and divide that by 2. And that gives us food web connectance, okay, or the maximum number of links, I should say. So let's do an example. Let's say we have, I don't know, let's say we have species richness of 8. So in this case, it would be 8 times 8 minus 1 divided by 2, right? So 8 times 7 is 56, divided by 2 will be what, 28. So we have our maximum number of links equaling 28 in that case, okay? And again, this is just one more way to kind of quantify the relationships in food webs, okay? As I said, linkage density is a measure of the average number of links per species in the food web. It's going to be equal to the total number of links we can actually see, so the observed links, divided by the total number of species, all right? So again, our linkage density equals number of links we observed divided by the number of species. So if we had number of links, again, equaling 8, and we had 7 species, we'd have 1.14, and I think that's what we saw in a previous example. So that, again, then is going to be a measure of the number of links per species in our food web, okay? All right. And we've talked about chain length. Okay, so the number of species interactions that are possible, in other words, the number of links that we have in a community, no surprise, actually increases with species richness. That makes perfect sense, right? The maximum number of links is S squared, so the larger S is, the bigger that number is. But an important question is how does species richness actually influence food web complexity? I mean, yeah, the number of possible interactions goes up with species richness, but does that mean the number of actual interactions goes up? That's an important question in community ecology. There was a study done in, I believe, Caribbean marine ecosystems. There's one study. There were a lot of other studies done as well. Your author of your book actually cites 19 different studies, some in marine ecosystems, some in terrestrial, some in freshwater, that were looking at this question of, how does species richness affect food web complexity? And what they generally found was, across all those different studies, was that the connectance actually decreases with species richness, but the linkage density and mean chain length actually increase. So what this is sort of suggesting is that linkage density, again, being the average number of links per species, that would go up. I mean, you've got carnivores that in more complex ecosystems have more food options available to them because there are a lot more species at the intermediate level that they can actually feed on. Herbivores, for example. So that makes perfect sense. But in terms of connectance actually decreasing, that one doesn't seem to be quite as intuitive based on our expectations of what might happen as complexity of the food web goes up. So let's go get into that a little bit. So what you see, past all that. Here we go. So this is actually the results, a summary of the results from those 19 studies. This is called a meta-analysis, where researchers will look at all these different studies, 19 in this case, and sort of summarize the results of all those together. And so what we see here on the x-axis in all three of these graphs is the species richness, number of species, right? And in our first one here, we have the mean chain length. So chain length is going up. This means that there are more intermediate species between the top predator in these systems and the basal level, okay, as species richness increases. Not too surprising. Here we have the linkage density, so the average number of links per species. So as our species richness goes up, we see that increases as well. And then finally we have connectance, okay, so our species richness, as it goes up, the connectance actually goes down a little bit. It's almost as if, species are living in a really, really diverse, species-rich ecosystem, sort of have more options. They pick and choose, and they might actually interact with fewer species in terms of the proportion of total number of species present. Okay, so that's probably what's going on there, but that's a little bit counterintuitive. I mean, these last two certainly seem to make sense in terms of what you'd expect with species richness increasing. But here, the actual connectance going down, that's probably a result of the proportional nature of connectance as it relates to the total number of species that are present. That doesn't mean that these food webs, though, that are very species rich aren't complex, because they certainly are. I mean, think about the Amazon rainforest, for example. Okay, so as species richness increases, the structure of a food web certainly becomes more complex, more complicated. And what is often seen in more complex food webs or ecosystems is that the food webs in them often become compartmentalized. So it's almost as if you have species, that are sort of operating within the same compartment, a group of species operating within that, interacting maybe just amongst themselves primarily, and they may have actually few interactions with species in other compartments. And this actually may be part also of what's going on here with the connectance going down as species richness goes up. You start to get this compartmentalization, and so species within these various particular compartments are actually interacting with just a few species also present in that same compartment, and they're not interacting with other species, community-wide. Okay, so let's take a look at compartmentalization here. So here we have two representations of a food web consisting of 11 species. So the circles are these different species, and here we can see a very interconnected, non-compartmentalized representation of the food web. Lots of links going from all these different species in a very web-like, mesh-like nature. Here we have compartmentalization, where these 5 species tend to interact amongst themselves, and these 6 species tend to interact amongst themselves. There is one link between 2 species across those different food webs, or compartments rather, of the same food web. Oops, sorry. There is one interaction there, if I can get this right. One interaction there, sorry about that. But again, this may be part of the explanation for why connectance tends to go down as species richness goes up. It's almost as if species are sort of becoming more specialized in terms of who they interact with in the really diverse community. Okay, so there was a study of a Caribbean marine food web. That's the one I actually mentioned earlier, where there were a total of 249 species documented as being part of this marine food web, and a total of about 3,300 different interactions or links between them. What this study showed is that basically there were all these different species, and interactions were sort of compartmentalized amongst 5 different compartments. And these compartments were sort of separated from each other based on, for example, differences in body size of the animals, organisms that were in them, the range of prey that they were feeding upon, the use of shore versus offshore habitats, and what predators were actually interacting with the species in these compartments. So these were sort of the 4 criteria that were sort of apparently used to distinguish these compartments from each other. And what you can see in B, for example, these are the 5 compartments that they had, and the larger the circle, the more higher the species richness was within those compartments. But you see the very complex arrangement of links between the compartments. If they had shown you the links within the compartments themselves, you'd see a much higher density of links within each of these compartments compared to the links between them. And again, that's what the compartmentalization is all about. This figure on the top is really busy. Maybe if they'd blown this up a lot more, you could see what was going on. But basically, you see the same 5 compartments: the purple one, the red, the orange, the green, and the lighter purple over here, the violet. And this does kind of give you an idea of the interactions within the compartments. You can see how dense those small lines are, almost completely blacked out. They're so dense within this compartment. certainly a lot more interactions going on in that compartment than between it and its adjacent compartments. And again, that's the whole idea behind compartmentalization. But if you look at all of this, there are about 3,300 links, 3,300 trophic interactions, but overall the connectance is lower than what you might see in a less diverse or less species-rich community because of this internal compartmentalization, okay? And again, that's why one reason why the connectance tends to go down in more species-rich communities. Okay, so any two species in a food web are going to be linked at least by a single arrow from prey to predator. We've talked about that. That's the basic sort of interaction that you can very easily understand from one of these food web diagrams, right? The arrow shows you which way the energy flows. But the dynamics within a community don't involve only those direct species interactions where one species preys upon another or is preyed upon by another. There are much more indirect interactions that are not so obvious and that are much more difficult to sort of show in these food web diagrams. For example, you can have a predator that might feed upon two different intermediate level herbivores. Now, because it maybe keeps both of their populations below their carrying capacities, that actually reduces competition between those two species of herbivores. Think about back to the previous couple of chapters we talked about with interspecific or intraspecific competition. So by that predator keeping both of their populations below their individual or respective carrying capacities, that reduces competition between them. That's an example of an indirect effect or indirect relationship that's really difficult to sort of show in these sort of food web diagrams, and it just shows you that there can be lots of those types of indirect interactions, and that just adds even more to the complexity of interactions in food webs, okay? So these indirect effects also need to be considered when we're trying to analyze community structure. All right, so hopefully by this point you've gotten the idea that food webs can become very complex as the number of species increases. Now, we can actually simplify these food web diagrams, the representation of the interactions in them, by grouping species into broader categories that represent what are called feeding groups, okay? So for example, we have organisms that we talked about before that feed themselves, right? So we have autotrophs, okay? Those are also called primary producers. Primary producers, all right? Usually they're photosynthetic, okay? We have heterotrophs. Heterotrophs are other feeders. Hetero means other or different, so these are other feeders. They feed on other organisms, okay? And these are referred to also as the consumers of a community. They derive their energy by consuming, tissue of plants and other animals. So these are referred to as trophic levels. All right, trophic levels, feeding levels, in other words, of the food web. Now, trophic levels, autotroph, heterotroph, for example, define groups of species that acquire energy in a very similar way, so they're really more of a functional classification, okay? They define organisms or categorize organisms into groups based on what those organisms do, how they gain their energy. It's a functional classification or definition. Now, we can also take trophic levels and subdivide them into what are called guilds. All right, guilds are groups of species that use a fairly common resource in a fairly similar way. All right, so good example of that. First of all, these are functionally similar species in the community. Good examples, you have seed-eating birds, okay? Small mammals, those could represent two different guilds within a community. You may have nectar-feeding birds, like hummingbirds, for example, that exploit, the nectar of flowering plants. Those might be considered a guild. So the point about guilds is that they tend to group species together based on their use of a shared resource. That's the important point there, all right? And this creates the potential for very strong interactions, especially interspecific, so competition between species, interspecific competition, but it also, we have weaker interactions with the rest of the community as well, all right? So one reason why we might have look at these sort of trophic interactions in terms of guilds is to get some more resolution on what's actually going on, higher resolution. And by grouping species into guilds, it can really simplify the study of these very, very complex communities and food webs by sort of creating subsets that can be easier, or I guess more manageable, for researchers to actually study, okay? And it can also allow studies of the level of organization within the community also, because the interactions of guilds can actually affect community structure and community dynamics. All right. So this idea of the guild, for example, has recently been expanded to an approach that classifies species based on function rather than on the typical taxonomic groupings that we're used to thinking of. More often than not, no, we shouldn't say that. In many cases today, we have researchers looking at species in terms of what's called or referred to as a functional type. Okay, a functional type. This is a way to group species based on a number of different things. For example, their life history characteristics. You can group them based on their role within the community. You can group them based on how they respond to particular environmental or aspects of the environment. So a common response to the environment, for example. A good example of a functional type might be the plants and of the different photosynthetic pathways. So we tend to talk about C3 plants primarily in like our intro level courses when we talk about photosynthesis, but there's also a C4 pathway. There's also a CAM pathway. So we can basically sort of separate plants out into functional types based on the type of photosynthesis that they primarily use to feed themselves with. We can also break plants out into functional types based on their shade tolerance, for example. There are a lot of different ways you can do it. You can do it you can do the same thing to animals as well. But again, there are a lot of different ways to sort of organize the interactions that we see within food webs, and you really have to do that because, as we've seen, food webs can be exceedingly complex, especially the species-rich, very species-rich ones. All right, I think that's a good place to stop. We're going to talk about, in the next video lecture, the physical structure of communities. So we're going to stop here, and then we'll have one more video lecture for this chapter.